Xing a Paragraph by Edgar Allan Poe. As it is well known that the wise men in the Bible came from the East, and as Mr. Touch-and-Go Bullethead came from the East, Mr. Bullethead was therefore a wise man. And if further proof of the matter is needed, here we have it. Mr. B was an editor. A bad temper was his only weakness. He did not consider his inability ever to change his mind a weakness. It was, he firmly believed, his strong point. I have shown that Touch-and-Go Bullethead was a wise man, and the only occasion on which he was not wise was when, leaving the proper home for all wise men, the East, he moved to the city of Alexander the Greatonopolis, or some place of similar name, out west. But I must be fair and say that when he made up his mind finally to settle in that town, he thought that no newspaper, and therefore no editor, existed in that particular part of the country. When he started the newspaper which he called the Teapot, he expected to have no competition. I feel sure that he would never have thought of going to live in Alexander the Greatonopolis if he had known that in Alexander the Greatonopolis there lived a gentleman named John Smith, if I rightly remember, who for many years had quietly grown fat editing the Alexander the Greatonopolis Daily News. It was only, therefore, because he was not told about John Smith that Mr. Bullethead found himself in suppose we call it Nopolis for short, but as he did find himself there, and rather than admit to a mistake, he decided to remain. So he did remain, and he did more. He got out his printing press, rented an office exactly opposite that of the Daily News, and the third morning after his arrival saw the appearance of the first number of the Nopolis Teapot. As nearly as I can remember, this was the name of the new paper. The leading article, I must admit, was excellent and very severe. It was especially bitter about things in general, and as for the editor of the Daily News, he was cruelly criticized. Some of Bullethead's remarks were really so strong that I am astonished that John Smith managed to live through the experience. I cannot hope to give all the Teapot's words exactly, but one paragraph goes like this. "Oh, yes. Oh, we can see. Oh, no doubt. The editor opposite is such a clever man. Oh, dear. Oh, goodness. What is the world coming to?" An article as bitter and well-formed as this exploded like a bomb among the peaceful citizens of Nopolis. Groups of excited people met to discuss it on street corners. Everyone waited nervously for John Smith's reply. Next morning, it appeared in the Daily News as follows. "In the Teapot of yesterday, we find the words, 'Oh, yes. Oh, we can see. Oh, no doubt. Oh, dear. Oh, goodness. Why, the man is all oh. That explains why he reasons in a circle, and why there is neither beginning nor end to him, nor to anything he says. We really do not believe the man can write a word that hasn't an O in it. We wonder if this owing is a habit of his. He came from the East in a great hurry. We wonder if he owes as much there as he does here. Oh, it is pitiful. I shall not attempt to describe the anger of Mr. Bullethead at these shocking suggestions. He did not seem to be as angry at the attack on his honesty as one would have imagined. It was the attack on his style that upset him. What? He, Touch-and-Go Bullethead, not able to write a word without an O in it? He would soon show Smith that he was mistaken. Yes, he would let Mr. John Smith see that he, Bullethead, could write a whole paragraph, even a whole article, in which that unfortunate vowel did not once appear. But no, that would be doing just what John Smith wanted. He, Bullethead, would make no change in his style for the satisfaction of Mr. Smith in the world. The O forever. He would keep the O. He would use O whenever he liked. Burning with this determination, the great Touch-and-Go in the next teapot came out with this simple paragraph. The editor of the Teapot has the honour of advising the editor of the Daily News that he, the Teapot, will take an opportunity in tomorrow morning's paper of proving to him, the Daily News, that he, the Teapot, both can and will be his own master in his written style. He, the Teapot, will write for the particular satisfaction of him, the Daily News, a leading article of some length in which the beautiful letter O shall most certainly not be avoided by his, the Daily News's, most obedient servant, the Teapot. To carry out this terrible threat which he had made, the great Bullethead sat up all night, burning the midnight lamp oil, and busy with the really unequalled paragraph which follows. So, ho, John, told you so, you know. Don't shout another time before you're out of the woods. Does your mother know you're out? Oh, no, no. So go home at once now, John, to your old woods. Go home to your woods. Go. You won't? Oh, pooh, John. Don't do so. You've got to go, you know. So go at once, and don't go slow, for nobody owns you here, you know. You're only a cow, a poor, good-for-nothing-to-nobody dog. Don't complain so, you fool. Oh, John, how you do look. Told you so, you know. Go and drown your sorrows in a bowl. Tired out, of course, by so wonderful a piece of work, the great Touch-and-Go could do nothing more that night. He handed his article to the printer's boy, who was waiting, and walked slowly home to bed. The printer's boy, to whom the article was trusted, ran upstairs in a great hurry and prepared to set the article in print. First, of course, as the opening word was "so," he looked for and found a capital S. Pleased with this success, he immediately threw himself on the box where the little O's were kept. But who can describe his feelings of horror when his fingers came out of it without a letter in them? Who can tell of his astonishment and anger when he realized that the little box was completely empty? Not a single little O was in the little O box, and, looking fearfully at the capital O box, he found that in exactly the same state, empty. He ran to his master. "Sir," said he, breathlessly, "I can set up nothing without no O's." "What do you mean by that?" said the chief, who was very angry at being kept from his bed so late. "Well, sir, there isn't an O in the office, neither a big one nor a little one." "What has happened to all those that were in the box?" "I don't know, sir," said the boy, "but one of those Daily News people has been wandering about here, and I expect he's taken every one." "I haven't a doubt of it," replied the chief angrily, turning purple in the face with anger. "But I tell you what to do, Bob. That's a good boy. You go over to the Daily News the first chance you get and take every one of their eyes." "Right," replied Bob. "I'll go. I'll show them a thing or two. But what about that paragraph? It must go in tonight, you know. If not, there'll be trouble." "Trouble enough. Is it a long paragraph, Bob?" "I shouldn't call it a very long paragraph." "Ah, well then, do the best you can with it. We must get it ready," said the chief, who was buried in work. "Just put in some other letter for O. Nobody's going to read the man's nonsense in any case." "Very well," replied Bob. "Here I go." And off he hurried. "So I have to put out their eyes, do I?" The fact is that although Bob was only 12 years old and 4 feet high, he was always ready for a fight. The difficulty described here happens quite frequently in printing offices, and I cannot explain it, but the fact is certain that when the difficulty does come up, it almost always happens that the letter X is used instead of the letter which is missing. The true reason, perhaps, is that X is the most plentiful letter in the boxes, or it was so in old times, for long enough to make the use of it a habit with printers. Bob would have thought it quite wrong to use any other letter than X. "I shall have to X this paragraph," he said to himself, as he read it over in astonishment. "But it's just about the worst paragraph of O's that I've ever seen." So he did X the paragraph, and that is how it was printed. Next morning, the population of Nopolis were all astonished to read in the Teapot the following leading article. The confusion caused by this strange article cannot be imagined. The first idea in the minds of the population was that some devilish trick was hidden by the signs, and there was a general rush to Bullethead's house for the purpose of punishing him, as he deserved. But that gentleman was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared, no one could tell how, and not even his shadow has ever been seen since. Unable to find him, people's anger died down at last, but there remained quite a variety of opinions about this unhappy affair. One gentleman thought the whole thing an excellent joke. Another could only suppose that Bullethead had decided to express his anger in the most imaginative way that he could, and to set an example to our children, suggested another. It was clear to all that Bullethead had been driven to extreme action, and in fact, since that editor could not be found, there was some talk of punishing the other one. The more common feeling, though, was that the affair was simply impossible to explain. Nobody could understand what had happened. The opinion of Bob, the printer's boy, who said nothing about his having X'd the paragraph, did not receive as much attention as I think it deserved. He said that he had no doubt about the matter at all, that it was a clear case that Mr. Bullethead never could be persuaded to drink like other people, but drank beer all the time, which filled him with wind and made him cross in the extreme.
Why the little Frenchman wears his hand in a sling. It's on my visiting card, sure enough, and it's them that's all a pink satin paper, that any gentleman that pleases may behold the interesting words, Sir Patrick O'Grandison, Baronet, 39 Southampton Row, Russell Square, Parish of Bloomsbury. And should you be wanting to discover who is the pink of politeness quite, and the leader of the hot ton of the whole city of London, why, it's just myself. And faith, that same is no wonder at all, so be pleased to stop curling your nose. For every 6 inch of the week that I've been a gentleman, and left off with the bog throtthin to take up with the baronessy, it's Patrick that's been the living like a holy emperor, and getting the education and the graces. Ah, and wouldn't it be a blessed thing for your spirits if you could lay your 2 peepers just upon Sir Patrick O'Grandison, Baronet, when he's all ready dressed for the opera, or stepping into the brisky for the drive into the Hyde Park. But it's the elegant big figure that I have, for the reason of which all the ladies fall in love with me. Isn't it my own sweet self now that'll measure the 6 foot and the 3 inches more nor that in me stockings, and that I'm exceedingly well proportioned all over to match? And it is really more than 3 foot and a bit that there is anyhow of the little old foreigner Frenchman that lives just over the way, and that's a-ogling and a-goggling the whole day, and bad luck to him, at the purty widdy Mrs. Treacle, that's my own next-door neighbour, God bless her, and a most particular friend and acquaintance. You perceive the little spalpeen is somewhat down in the mouth, and wears his left hand in a sling. And it's for that same thing, by your lave, that I'm going to give you the good reason. The truth of the whole matter is just simple enough. For the very first day that I come from Connaught, and showed my sweet little self in the street to the widdy, who was looking through the windy, it was a gone case altogether with the heart of the purty Mistress Treacle. I perceived it, you see, all at once, and no mistake, and that's God's truth. First of all, it was up with the windy in a jiffy, and then she threw open her 2 peepers to the utmost, and then it was a little gold spy-glass that she clapped tight to one of 'em, and divil may burn me if it didn't spake to me as plain as a peeper could spake, and says it through the spy-glass, "Ah, the tip of the morning to you, Sir Patrick O'Grandison, Baronet, mavourneen, and it's a neat gentleman that ye are, sure enough, and it's meself and me fortin just that'll be at your service, dear, any time o' day at all, for the asking. And it's not meself you would have to be bait in the politeness, so I made her a bow that would have broken your heart altogether to behold. And then I pulled off me hat with a flourish, and then I winked at her hard with both eyes, as much as to say, "True for you, you sweet little creature, Mrs. Treacle, me darlint, and I wish I may be drowned dead in a bog, if it's not myself, Sir Patrick O'Grandison, Baronet, that'll make a whole bushel of love to your ladyship in the twinkling of the eye of a Londonderry parade." And it was the next morning, sure, just as I was making up my mind whether it wouldn't be the polite thing to send a bit of writing to the widdy by way of a love letter, when up comed the delivery servant with an elegant card, and he told me that the name on it, for I never could read the copper plate printed on account of being left-handed, was all about Monsieur the Count Auguste Lucchese Maître de Dons, and that the whole of the devilish lingo was a spalpeeny long name of the little old foreigner Frenchman as lived over the way. And just with that in come the little villain himself. And then he made me a broth of a bow, and then he said he had only taken the liberty of doing me the honour of giving me a call. And then he went on to palaver at a great rate, and divil the bit did I comprehend what he would be after the telling me at all, excepting and saving that he said "Pully-woo, woolly-woo," and told me, among a bushel of lies, bad luck to him, that he was mad for the love of my widdy Mistress Treacle, and that my widdy Mrs. Treacle had a puncheon for him. At the hearing of this, you may swear, though, I was as mad as a grasshopper. But I remembered that I was Sir Patrick O'Grandison, Baronet, and that it wasn't altogether genteel to let the anger get the upper hand of the politeness. So I made light of the matter and kept dark, and got quite sociable with the little chap. And after a while, what did he do but ask me to go with him to the widdy's, saying he would give me the fashionable introduction to her ladyship. "Is it there ye are?" said I then to myself. "And it's true for you, Patrick, that you're the fortunatest mortal in life. We'll soon see now whether it's your sweet self, or whether it's little Monsieur Maître de Dons that Mrs. Treacle is head and ears in the love with." With that we went aft to the widdy's next door, and ye may well say it was an elegant place, so it was. There was a carpet all over the floor, and in one corner there was a 40-penny and a Jew's harp, and the devil knows what else, and in another corner was a sofy, the beautifulest thing in all nature, and sitting on the sofy, sure enough, there was the sweet little angel, Mistress Treacle. "The tip of the morning to you," says I, "Mrs. Treacle." And then I made certain elegant obeisance that it would have quite altogether bewildered the brain of ye. "Woolly-woo, pully-woo, plump in the mud," says the little foreigner Frenchman. "And sure, Mrs. Treacle," says he that he did, "isn't this gentleman here just his Reverence Sir Patrick O'Grandison, Baronet? And isn't he altogether and entirely the most particular friend and acquaintance that I have in the whole world?" And with that the widdy she gets up from the sofy, and makes the sweetest curtsy nor ever was seen, and then down she sits like an angel. And then, by the powers, it was that little spalpeen, Monsieur Maître de Dons, that plumped hisself right down by the right side of her. Och, hon, I expected the two eyes of me would have comed out of my head on the spot, I was so desperate mad. However, "But who," says I after a while, "is it there ye are, Monsieur Maître de Dons?" And so down I plumped on the left side of her ladyship to be even with the villain. botheration, it would have done your heart good to perceive the elegant double wink that I gave her just then, right in the face with both eyes. But the little old Frenchman, he never began to suspect me at all, and desperate hard it was he made the love to her ladyship. "Woolly woo," says he, "pooly woo," says he, "plump in the mud," says he. "That's all to no use, Monsieur Frog Mavourneen," thinks I, and I talked as hard and as fast as I could all the while. And troth it was myself just that diverted her ladyship completely and entirely by reason of the elegant conversation that I kept up with her all about the dear bogs of Connaught. And by she give me such a sweet smile from one end of her mouth to the other that it made me as bold as a pig, and I just took hold of the end of her little finger in the most delicatest manner in nature, looking at her all the while out of the whites of my eyes. And then only perceive the cuteness of the sweet angel, for no sooner did she observe that I was after the squeezing of her flipper than she up with it in a jiffy and put it away behind her back, just as much as to say, "Now then, Sir Patrick O'Grandison, there's a bit of chance for ye, Mavourneen, for it's not altogether the genteel thing to be after the squeezing of my flipper, right full in the sight of that little foreign Frenchman, Monsieur Maître de Dans." With that I gived her a big wink just to say, let Sir Patrick alone for the likes of them tricks. And then I went easy to work, and you'd have died with the diversion to behold how cleverly I slipped my right arm between the back of the sofa and the back of her ladyship. And there, sure enough, I found a sweet little flipper all a-waiting to say, "The tip of the morning to you, Sir Patrick O'Grandison, Baronet." And wasn't it myself sure that just give it the least little bit of a squeeze in the world, all in the way of a commencement, and not to be too rough with her ladyship. And botheration! Wasn't it the genteelest and delicatest of all the little squeezes that I got in return? Blood and thunder, Sir Patrick Mavourneen, thinks I to myself. Faith, he's just the mother's son of you and nobody else at all, that's the handsomest and fortunest young bog-throther that ever comed out of Connaught. And with that I give the flipper a big squeeze, and a big squeeze it was by the powers that her ladyship give to me back. But it would have split the seven sides of you with a laughing to behold, just then, all at once, the conceited behaviour of Monsieur Maître de Dans. The likes of such jabbering and a smirking and a parley wooing as he beginned with her ladyship never was known before upon earth, and divil may burn me if it wasn't me own very two peepers that cotched him tipping her the wink out of one eye. And if it wasn't meself, then that was as mad as a Kilkenny cat. I should like to be told who it was. "Let me inform you, Monsieur Maître de Dans," said I, as polite as ever ye seed, "that it's not the genteel thing at all, and not for the likes of you anyhow, to be after the ogling and a goggling at her ladyship in that fashion." And just with that such another squeeze as it was I gived her flipper, all as much as to say, "Isn't it Sir Patrick now, my jewel, that'll be able to the protecting of you, my darlint?" And then there comed another squeeze back, all by the way of the answer. "True for you, Sir Patrick," it said, as plain as ever a squeeze said in the world. "True for you, Sir Patrick Mavourneen, and it's a proper nae gentleman ye are, that's God's truth." And with that she opened her two beautiful peepers, till I believed they could have comed out of her head altogether and entirely. and she looked first as mad as a cat at Monsieur Frog, and then as smiling as all out o' doors at myself. Then says he, the villain, "Och, hon, and the woolly-woo, pooly-woo," and then with that he shoved up his 2 shoulders till the divil the bit of his head was to be discovered, and then he let down the 2 corners of his parati trap, and then not a ha'porth more of the satisfaction could I get out of the spalpeen. Believe me, my jewel, it was Sir Patrick that was unreasonable mad thin, and the more by token that the Frenchman kept on with his winking at the widdy, and the widdy she kept on with the squeezing of my flipper, as much as to say, "At him again, Sir Patrick O'Grandison, mavourneen." So I just ripped out with a big oath, and says I, "You little spalpeeny frog of a bog-throtting son of a bloody noon," and just then what do you think it was that her ladyship did? Troth, she jumped up from the sofy as if she was bit, and made off through the door, while I turned my head round after her in a complete bewilderment and botheration, and followed her with me 2 papers. You perceive I had a reason of my own for knowing that she couldn't get down the stairs altogether and entirely, for I knew very well that I had hold of her hand, for the devil the bit had I ever let it go. And says I, "Isn't it the least little bit of a mistake in the world that you've been after making, your ladyship? Come back now, that's a darlint, and I'll give you your flipper." But off she went down the stairs like a shot, and then I turned round to the little French foreigner. "Och, hon, if it wasn't his spalpeeny little paw that I had hold of in my own, why then it wasn't. That's all. And maybe it wasn't myself that just died then outright with a laughing, to behold the little chap when he found out that it wasn't the widdy at all, that he had hold of all the time, but only Sir Patrick O'Grandison. The old divil himself never beheld such a long face as he put on. As for Sir Patrick O'Grandison, Baronet, it wasn't for the likes of his reverence to be after the minding of a trifle of a mistake. You may just say, though, for it's God's truth, that afore I left hold of the flipper of the spalpeen, which was not till after her ladyship's footman had kicked us both down the stairs, I'd give it such a neat little broth of a squeeze as made it all up into raspberry jam. "Woolly-woo," says he, "pooly-woo," says he, "cut damn." And that's just the truth of the reason why he wears his left hand in a sling. Loss of breath. The most notorious ill-fortune must in the end yield to the untiring courage of philosophy, as the most stubborn city to the ceaseless vigilance of an enemy. Shalmaneser, as we have it in the holy writings, lay 3 years before Samaria, yet it fell. Sardanapalus, see Diodorus, maintained himself 7 in Nineveh, but to no purpose. Troy expired at the close of the 2nd lustrum, and Azoth, as Aristaeus declares upon his honour as a gentleman, opened at last her gates to Samenitus, after having barred them for the 5th part of a century. "Thou wretch, thou vixen, thou shrew," said I to my wife on the morning after our wedding, "thou witch, thou hag, thou whippersnapper, thou sink of iniquity, thou fiery-faced quintessence of all that is abominable, thou, here, standing upon tiptoe, seizing her by the throat, and placing my mouth close to her ear, I was preparing to launch forth a new and more decided epithet of opprobrium, which should not fail, if ejaculated, to convince her of her insignificance, when, to my extreme horror and astonishment, I discovered that I had lost my breath. The phrases, "I am out of breath," "I have lost my breath," etc., are often enough repeated in common conversation, but it had never occurred to me that the terrible accident of which I speak could bona fide and actually happen. Imagine, that is, if you have a fanciful turn, imagine, I say, my wonder, my consternation, my despair. There is a good genius, however, which has never entirely deserted me. In my most ungovernable moods I still retain a sense of propriety, et le chemin des passions me conduit, as Lord Edward in the Julie says it did him, à la philosophie véritable. Although I could not at first precisely ascertain to what degree the occurrence had affected me, I determined at all events to conceal the matter from my wife, until further experience should discover to me the extent of this my unheard-of calamity. Altering my countenance, therefore, in a moment, from its bepuffed and distorted appearance, I gave my lady a pat on the one cheek and a kiss on the other, and without saying one syllable, furious I could not, left her astonished at my drollery, as I pirouetted out of the room in a pas de zéphyr. Behold me, then, safely ensconced in my private boudoir, a fearful instance of the ill consequences attending upon irascibility, alive with the qualifications of the dead, dead with the propensities of the living, an anomaly on the face of the earth, being very calm, yet breathless. Yes, breathless. I am serious in asserting that my breath was entirely gone. I could not have stirred with it a feather if my life had been at issue, or sullied even the delicacy of a mirror. Hard fate! Yet there was some alleviation to the first overwhelming paroxysm of my sorrow. I found, upon trial, that the powers of utterance which, upon my inability to proceed in the conversation with my wife, I then concluded to be totally destroyed, were in fact only partially impeded, and I discovered that had I, at that interesting crisis, dropped my voice to a singularly deep guttural, I might still have continued to her the communication of my sentiments. This pitch of voice, the guttural, depending, I find, not upon the current of the breath, but upon a certain spasmodic action of the muscles of the throat. Throwing myself upon a chair, I remained for some time absorbed in meditation. My reflections, be sure, were of no consolatory kind. 1,000 vague and lachrymatory fancies took possession of my soul, and even the idea of suicide flitted across my brain. But it is a trait in the perversity of human nature to reject the obvious and the ready for the far distant and equivocal. Thus I shuddered at self-murder as the most decided of atrocities, while the tabby cat purred strenuously upon the rug, and the very water-dog wheezed assiduously under the table, each taking to itself much merit for the strength of its lungs, and all obviously done in derision of my own pulmonary incapacity. Oppressed with a tumult of vague hopes and fears, I at length heard the footsteps of my wife descending the staircase. Being now assured of her absence, I returned with a palpitating heart to the scene of my disaster. Carefully locking the door on the inside, I commenced a vigorous search. It was possible, I thought, that, concealed in some obscure corner or lurking in some closet or drawer, might be found the lost object of my inquiry. It might have a vapoury, it might even have a tangible form. Most philosophers upon many points of philosophy are still very unphilosophical. William Godwin, however, says in his Mandeville that invisible things are the only realities, and this, all will allow, is a case in point. I would have the judicious reader pause before accusing such asseverations of an undue quantum of absurdity. Anaxagoras, it will be remembered, maintained that snow is black, and this I have since found to be the case. Long and earnestly did I continue the investigation, but the contemptible reward of my industry and perseverance proved to be only a set of false teeth, 2 pair of hips, an eye, and a number of billets doux from Mr. Windenuff to my wife. I might as well here observe that this confirmation of my lady's partiality for Mr. W. occasioned me little uneasiness. That Mrs. Lackabreath should admire anything so dissimilar to myself was a natural and necessary evil. I am, it is well known, of a robust and corpulent appearance, and at the same time somewhat diminutive in stature. What wonder, then, that the lath-like tenuity of my acquaintance and his altitude, which has grown into a proverb, should have met with all due estimation in the eyes of Mrs. Lackabreath. But to return. My exertions, as I have before said, proved fruitless. Closet after closet, drawer after drawer, corner after corner, was scrutinized to no purpose. At one time, however, I thought myself sure of my prize, having, in rummaging a dressing-case, accidentally demolished a bottle of Grandjean's oil of archangels, which, as an agreeable perfume, I here take the liberty of recommending. With a heavy heart I returned to my boudoir, there to ponder upon some method of eluding my wife's penetration until I could make arrangements prior to my leaving the country, for to this I had already made up my mind. In a foreign climate, being unknown, I might, with some probability of success, endeavour to conceal my unhappy calamity, a calamity calculated even more than beggary to estrange the affections of the multitude, and to draw down upon the wretch the well-merited indignation of the virtuous and the happy. I was not long in hesitation. Being naturally quick, I committed to memory the entire tragedy of Metamora. I had the good fortune to recollect that in the accentuation of this drama, or at least of such portion of it as is allotted to the hero, the tones of voice in which I found myself deficient were altogether unnecessary, and that the deep guttural was expected to reign monotonously throughout. I practised for some time by the borders of a well-frequented marsh. Herein, however, having no reference to a similar proceeding of Demosthenes, but from a design peculiarly and conscientiously my own. Thus armed at all points, I determined to make my wife believe that I was suddenly smitten with a passion for the stage. In this I succeeded to a miracle, and to every question or suggestion found myself at liberty to reply in my most frog-like and sepulchral tones with some passage from the tragedy, any portion of which, as I soon took pleasure in observing, would apply equally well to any particular subject. It is not to be supposed, however, that in the delivery of such passages I was found at all deficient in the looking asquint, the showing my teeth, the working my knees, the shuffling my feet, or in any of those unmentionable graces which are now justly considered the characteristics of a popular performer. To be sure, they spoke of confining me in a straitjacket, but, good God, they never suspected me of having lost my breath. Having at length put my affairs in order, I took my seat very early one morning in the mail stage for giving it to be understood among my acquaintances that business of the last importance required my immediate personal attendance in that city. The coach was crammed to repletion, but in the uncertain twilight the features of my companions could not be distinguished. Without making any effectual resistance, I suffered myself to be placed between two gentlemen of colossal dimensions, while a third, of a size larger, requesting pardon for the liberty he was about to take, threw himself upon my body at full length, and falling asleep in an instant, drowned all my guttural ejaculations for relief in a snore which would have put to blush the roarings of the bull of Phalaris. Happily, the state of my respiratory faculties rendered suffocation an accident entirely out of the question. As, however, the day broke more distinctly in our approach to the outskirts of the city, my tormentor, arising and adjusting his shirt collar, thanked me in a very friendly manner for my civility. Seeing that I remained motionless, all my limbs were dislocated and my head twisted on one side, his apprehensions began to be excited, and arousing the rest of the passengers, he communicated in a very decided manner his opinion that a dead man had been palmed upon them during the night for a living and responsible fellow-traveller, here giving me a thump on the right eye by way of demonstrating the truth of his suggestion. Hereupon all, one after another, there were 9 in company, believed it their duty to pull me by the ear. A young practising physician, too, having applied a pocket mirror to my mouth and found me without breath, the assertion of my persecutor was pronounced a true bill, and the whole party expressed a determination to endure tamely no such impositions for the future, and to proceed no farther with any such carcasses for the present. I was here accordingly thrown out at the sign of the Crow, by which tavern the coach happened to be passing, without meeting with any further accident than the breaking of both my arms, under the left hind wheel of the vehicle. I must, besides, do the driver the justice to state that he did not forget to throw after me the largest of my trunks, which, unfortunately, falling on my head, fractured my skull in a manner at once interesting and extraordinary. The landlord of the Crow, who is a hospitable man, finding that my trunk contained sufficient to indemnify him for any little trouble he might take in my behalf, sent forthwith for a surgeon of his acquaintance, and delivered me to his care with a bill and receipt for $10. The purchaser took me to his apartments and commenced operations immediately. Having cut off my ears, however, he discovered signs of animation. He now rang the bell and sent for a neighbouring apothecary with whom to consult in the emergency. In case of his suspicions with regard to my existence proving ultimately correct, he, in the meantime, made an incision in my stomach and removed several of my viscera for private dissection. The apothecary had an idea that I was actually dead. This idea I endeavoured to confute, kicking and plunging with all my might, and making the most furious contortions, for the operation of the surgeon had, in a measure, restored me to the possession of my faculties. All, however, was attributed to the effects of a new galvanic battery, wherewith the apothecary, who was really a man of information, performed several curious experiments, in which, from my personal share in their fulfilment, I could not help feeling deeply interested. It was a source of mortification to me, nevertheless, that, although I made several attempts at conversation, my powers of speech were so entirely in abeyance that I could not even open my mouth, much less, then, make reply to some ingenious but fanciful theories of which, under other circumstances, My minute acquaintance with the Hippocratian pathology would have afforded me a ready confutation. Not being able to arrive at a conclusion, the practitioners remanded me for further examination. I was taken up into a garret, and the surgeon's lady having accommodated me with drawers and stockings, the surgeon himself fastened my hands and tied up my jaws with a pocket handkerchief, then bolted the door on the outside as he hurried to his dinner, leaving me alone to silence and to meditation. I now discovered, to my extreme delight, that I could have spoken, had not my mouth been tied up with a pocket handkerchief. Consoling myself with this reflection, I was mentally repeating some passage of the omnipresence of the deity, as is my custom before resigning myself to sleep, when two cats of a greedy and vituperative turn, entering at a hole in the wall, leaped up with a flourish a la Catalani, and, alighting opposite one another on my visage, betook themselves to indecorous contention for the paltry consideration of my nose. But as the loss of his ears proved the means of elevating to the throne of Cyrus the Magian or Mige-Gush of Persia, and as the cutting off of his nose gave Zopyrus possession of Babylon, so the loss of a few ounces of my countenance proved the salvation of my body. Aroused by the pain and burning with indignation, I burst at a single effort the fastenings and the bandage. Stalking across the room, I cast a glance of contempt at the belligerents, and throwing open the sash to their extreme horror and disappointment, precipitated myself very dexterously from the window. The male robber W., to whom I bore a singular resemblance, was at this moment passing from the city jail to the scaffold erected for his execution in the suburbs. His extreme infirmity and long-continued ill health had obtained him the privilege of remaining unmanacled, and, habited in his gallows costume, one very similar to my own, he lay at full length in the bottom of the hangman's cart, which happened to be under the window of the surgeon at the moment of my precipitation, without any other guard than the driver, who was asleep, and two recruits of the 6th Infantry who were drunk. As ill luck would have it, I lit upon my feet within the vehicle. W., who was an acute fellow, perceived his opportunity. Leaping up immediately, he bolted out behind, and turning down an alley, was out of sight in the twinkling of an eye. The recruits, aroused by the bustle, could not exactly comprehend the merits of the transaction. Seeing, however, a man, the precise counterpart of the felon, standing upright in the cart before their eyes, they were of the opinion that the rascal, meaning W., was after making his escape, so they expressed themselves, and having communicated this opinion to one another, they took each a dram, and then knocked me down with the butt ends of their muskets. It was not long ere we arrived at the place of destination. Of course, nothing could be said in my defence. Hanging was my inevitable fate. I resigned myself thereto with a feeling half stupid, half acrimonious. Being little of a cynic, I had all the sentiments of a dog. The hangman, however, adjusted the noose about my neck. The drop fell. I forbear to depict my sensations upon the gallows, although here undoubtedly I could speak to the point, and it is a topic upon which nothing has been well said. In fact, to write upon such a theme it is necessary to have been hanged. Every author should confine himself to matters of experience. Thus Mark Antony composed a treatise upon getting drunk. I may just mention, however, that die I did not. My body was, but I had no breath to be, suspended, and but for the knot under my left ear, which had the feel of a military stock, I dare say that I should have experienced very little inconvenience. As for the jerk given to my neck upon the falling of the drop, it merely proved a corrective to the twist afforded me by the fat gentleman in the coach. For good reasons, however, I did my best to give the crowd the worth of their trouble. My convulsions were said to be extraordinary. My spasms it would have been difficult to beat. The populace encored. Several gentlemen swooned, and a multitude of ladies were carried home in hysterics. Pinxet availed himself of the opportunity to retouch, from a sketch taken upon the spot, his admirable painting of the Marseillaise flayed alive. When I had afforded sufficient amusement, it was thought proper to remove my body from the gallows. This the more especially as the real culprit had in the meantime been retaken and recognized, a fact which I was so unlucky as not to know. Much sympathy was, of course, exercised in my behalf, and as no one made a claim to my corpse, it was ordered that I should be interred in a public vault. Here, after due interval, I was deposited. The sexton departed, and I was left alone. A line of Marston's malcontent, "Death's a good fellow, and keeps open house," struck me at the moment as a palpable lie. I knocked off, however, the lid of my coffin and stepped out. The place was dreadfully dreary and damp, and I became troubled with ennui. By way of amusement I felt my way among the numerous coffins ranged in order around. I lifted them down one by one, and breaking open their lids, busied myself in speculations about the mortality within. This I soliloquized, tumbling over a carcass, puffy, bloated, and rotund. This has been, no doubt, in every sense of the word, an unhappy, an unfortunate man. It has been his terrible lot not to walk, but to waddle, to pass through life not like a human being, but like an elephant, not like a man, but like a rhinoceros. His attempts at getting on have been mere abortions, and his circumgyratory proceedings a palpable failure. Taking a step forward, it has been his misfortune to take 2 toward the right and 3 toward the left. His studies have been confined to the poetry of Crabbe. He can have no idea of the wonder of a pirouette. To him, a pas de papillon has been an abstract conception. He has never ascended the summit of a hill. He has never viewed from any steeple the glories of a metropolis. Heat has been his mortal enemy. In the dog days his days have been the days of a dog. Therein he has dreamed of flames and suffocation, of mountains upon mountains, of Pelion upon Ossa. He was short of breath. To say all in a word, he was short of breath. He thought it an extravagant to play upon wind instruments. He was the inventor of self-moving fans, wind sails, and ventilators. He patronized DuPont, the bellows-maker, and died miserably in attempting to smoke a cigar. His was a case in which I feel a deep interest, a lot in which I sincerely sympathize. "But here," said I, "here," and I dragged spitefully from its receptacle a gaunt, tall, and peculiar-looking form, whose remarkable appearance struck me with a sense of unwelcome familiarity. "Here is a wretch entitled to no earthly commiseration." Thus saying, in order to obtain a more distinct view of my subject, I applied my thumb and forefinger to its nose, and causing it to assume a sitting position on the ground, held it thus at the length of my arm while I continued my soliloquy. "Entitled," I repeated, "to no earthly commiseration. Who indeed would think of compassionating a shadow? Besides, has he not had his full share of the blessings of mortality? He was the originator of tall monuments, shot towers, lightning rods, Lombardy poplars. His treatise upon shades and shadows has immortalized him. He edited with distinguished ability the last edition of South on the Bones. He went early to college and studied pneumatics. He then came home, talked eternally, and played upon the French horn. He patronized the bagpipes. Captain Barclay, who walked against time, would not walk against him. Wyndham and Allbreath were his favourite writers, his favourite artist, Fizz. He died gloriously while inhaling gas. Levique flatu corrupitur, like the fama pudicitiae in Hieronymus. He was indubitably a— "How can you?" interrupted the object of my animadversions, gasping for breath and tearing off with a desperate exertion the bandage around his jaws. "How can you, Mr. Lack-a-Breath, be so infernally cruel as to pinch me in that manner by the nose? Did you not see how they had fastened up my mouth? And you must know, if you know anything, how vast a superfluity of breath I have to dispose of. If you do not know, however, sit down, and you shall see. In my situation it is really a great relief to be able to open one's mouth, to be able to expatiate, to be able to communicate with a person like yourself, who do not think yourself called upon at every period to interrupt the thread of a gentleman's discourse. Interruptions are annoying, and should undoubtedly be abolished. Don't you think so? No reply, I beg you. One person is enough to be speaking at a time. I shall be done by and by, and then you may begin. How the devil, sir, did you get into this place? Not a word, I beseech you. Been here some time myself. Terrible accident. Heard of it, I suppose. Awful calamity. Walking under your windows some short while ago, about the time you were stage-struck. Horrible occurrence. Heard of catching one's breath, eh? Hold your tongue, I tell you. I caught somebody else's. Had almost too much of my own. Met Blab at the corner of the street. Wouldn't give me a chance for a word. Couldn't get in a syllable edgeways. Attacked, consequently, with epilepsis. Blab made his escape. Damn old fools, they took me up for dead and put me in this place. Pretty doings, all of them. Heard all you said about me, every word a lie. Horrible, wonderful, outrageous, hideous, incomprehensible, etc., 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 etc. It is impossible to conceive my astonishment at so unexpected a discourse, or the joy with which I became gradually convinced that the breath so fortunately caught by the gentleman, whom I soon recognized as my neighbour Windenough, was in fact the identical expiration mislaid by myself in the conversation with my wife. Time, place, and circumstance rendered it a matter beyond question. I did not, however, immediately release my hold upon Mr. W.'s proboscis, not at least during the long period in which the inventor of Lombardy poplars continued to favour me with his explanations. In this respect I was actuated by that habitual prudence which has ever been my predominating trait. I reflected that many difficulties might still lie in the path of my preservation, which only extreme exertion on my part would be able to surmount. Many persons, I considered, are prone to estimate commodities in their possession, however valueless to thee then proprietor, however troublesome or distressing, in direct ratio with the advantages to be derived by others from their attainment, or by themselves from their abandonment. Might not this be the case with Mr. Windenuff? In displaying anxiety for the breath of which he was at present so willing to get rid, might I not lay myself open to the exactions of his avarice? There are scoundrels in this world, I remembered with a sigh, who will not scruple to take unfair opportunities with even a next-door neighbour. And, this remark is from Epictetus, it is precisely at that time when men are most anxious to throw off the burden of their own calamities that they feel the least desirous of relieving them in others. Upon considerations similar to these, and still retaining my grasp upon the nose of Mr. W., I accordingly thought proper to model my reply. "Monster!" I began in a tone of the deepest indignation. "Monster and double-winded idiot! Dost thou, whom for thine iniquities it has pleased heaven to accurse with a twofold respiration, dost thou, I say, presume to address me in the familiar language of an old acquaintance? I lie, forsooth, and hold my tongue, to be sure. Pretty conversation indeed to a gentleman with a single breath! All this, too, when I have it in my power to relieve the calamity under which thou dost so justly suffer, to curtail the superfluities of thine unhappy respiration." Like Brutus, I paused for a reply, with which, like a tornado, Mr. Windenuff immediately overwhelmed me. Protestation followed upon protestation, and apology upon apology. There were no terms with which he was unwilling to comply, and there were none of which I failed to take the fullest advantage. Preliminaries being at length arranged, my acquaintance delivered me the respiration for which, having carefully examined it, I gave him afterward a receipt. I am aware that by many I shall be held to blame for speaking, in a manner so cursory, of a transaction so impalpable. It will be thought that I should have entered more minutely into the details of an occurrence by which, and this is very true, much new light might be thrown upon a highly interesting branch of physical philosophy. To all this I am sorry that I cannot reply. A hint is the only answer which I am permitted to make. There were circumstances, but I think it much safer upon consideration to say as little as possible about an affair so delicate. So delicate, I repeat, and at the time involving the interests of a third party, whose sulphurous resentment I have not the least desire at this moment of incurring. We were not long after this necessary arrangement in effecting an escape from the dungeons of the sepulchre. The united strength of our resuscitated voices was soon sufficiently apparent. Scissors, the Whig editor, republished a treatise upon the nature and origin of subterranean noises. A reply, rejoinder, confutation, and justification followed in the columns of a Democratic Gazette. It was not until the opening of the vault to decide the controversy that the appearance of Mr. Windenuff and myself proved both parties to have been decidedly in the wrong. I cannot conclude these details of some very singular passages in a life at all times sufficiently eventful, without again recalling to the attention of the reader the merits of that indiscriminate philosophy which is a sure and ready shield against those shafts of calamity which can neither be seen, felt, nor fully understood. It was in the spirit of this wisdom that, among the ancient Hebrews, it was believed the gates of heaven would be inevitably opened to that sinner or saint who, with good lungs and implicit confidence, should vociferate the word Amen. It was in the spirit of this wisdom that, when a great plague raged at Athens, and every means had been in vain attempted for its removal, Epimenides, as Laertius relates in his second book of that philosopher, advised the erection of a shrine and temple to the proper god. The Man That Was Used Up, a tale of the late Bugaboo and Kickapoo campaign. I cannot just now remember when or where I first made the acquaintance of that truly fine-looking fellow, Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. Someone did introduce me to the gentleman, I am sure, at some public meeting I know very well, held about something of great importance, no doubt, at some place or other, I feel convinced, whose name I have unaccountably forgotten. The truth is that the introduction was attended upon my part with a degree of anxious embarrassment which operated to prevent any definite impressions of either time or place. I am constitutionally nervous. This, with me, is a family failing, and I can't help it. In especial, the slightest appearance of mystery, of any point I cannot exactly comprehend, puts me at once into a pitiable state of agitation. There was something, as it were, remarkable. Yes, remarkable, although this is but a feeble form to express my full meaning, about the entire individuality of the personage in question. He was, perhaps, 6 feet in height, and of a presence singularly commanding. There was an air distingué pervading the whole man, which spoke of high breeding, and hinted at high birth. Upon this topic, the topic of Smith's personal appearance, I have a kind of melancholy satisfaction in being minute. His head of hair would have done honour to a Brutus. Nothing could be more richly flowing or possess a brighter gloss. It was of a jetty black, which was also the colour, or more properly the no-colour, of his unimaginable whiskers. You perceive I cannot speak of these latter without enthusiasm. It is not too much to say that they were the handsomest pair of whiskers under the sun. At all events they encircled and at times partially overshadowed a mouth utterly unequalled. Here were the most entirely even and the most brilliantly white of all conceivable teeth. From between them, upon every proper occasion, issued a voice of surpassing clearness, melody, and strength. In the matter of the eyes also my acquaintance was preeminently endowed. Either one of such a pair was worth a couple of the ordinary ocular organs. They were of a deep hazel, exceedingly large and lustrous, and there was perceptible about them ever and anon just that amount of interesting obliquity which gives pregnancy to expression. The bust of the general was unquestionably the finest bust I ever saw. For your life you could not have found a fault with its wonderful proportion. This rare peculiarity set off to great advantage a pair of shoulders which would have called up a blush of conscious inferiority into the countenance of the marble Apollo. I have a passion for fine shoulders, and may say that I never beheld them in perfection before. The arms altogether were admirably modelled, nor were the lower limbs less superb. These were indeed the new plus ultra of good legs. Every connoisseur in such matters admitted the legs to be good. There was neither too much flesh nor too little, neither rudeness nor fragility. I could not imagine a more graceful curve than that of the os femoris, and there was just that due gentle prominence in the rear of the fibula, which goes to the conformation of a properly proportioned calf. I wish to God my young and talented friend Chip on Chippeno, the sculptor, had but seen the legs of Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. But although men so absolutely fine-looking are neither as plenty as reasons or blackberries, still I could not bring myself to believe that the remarkable something to which I alluded just now, that the odd air of je ne sais quoi, which hung about my new acquaintance, lay altogether, or indeed at all, in the supreme excellence of his bodily endowments. Perhaps it might be traced to the manner, yet here again I could not pretend to be positive. There was a primness, not to say stiffness, in his carriage, a degree of measured and, if I may so express it, of rectangular precision attending his every movement, which, observed in a more diminutive figure, would have had the least little savour in the world of affectation, pomposity, or constraint, but which, noticed in a gentleman of his undoubted dimensions, was readily placed to the account of reserve, hauteur, of a commendable sense, in short, of what is due to the dignity of colossal proportion. The kind friend who presented me to General Smith whispered in my ear some few words of comment upon the man. He was a remarkable man, a very remarkable man, indeed one of the most remarkable men of the age. He was an especial favourite, too, with the ladies, chiefly on account of his high reputation for courage. In that point he is unrivalled. Indeed, he is a perfect desperado, a downright fire-eater, and no mistake, said my friend, here dropping his voice excessively low, and thrilling me with the mystery of his tone. A downright fire-eater, and no mistake. Showed that, I should say, to some purpose, in the late tremendous swamp fight away down south with the Bugaboo and Kickapoo Indians. Here my friend opened his eyes to some extent. Bless my soul, blood and thunder and all that. Prodigies of valor. Heard of him, of course. You know he's the man. Man alive, how do you do? Why, how are you? Very glad to see you indeed. Here interrupted the General himself, seizing my companion by the hand as he drew near, and bowing stiffly but profoundly as I was presented. I then thought, and I think so still, that I never heard a clearer nor a stronger voice, nor beheld a finer set of teeth. But I must say that I was sorry for the interruption just at that moment, as, owing to the whispers and insinuations aforesaid, my interest had been greatly excited in the hero of the Bugaboo and Kickapoo campaign. However, the delightfully luminous conversation of Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith soon completely dissipated this chagrin. My friend leaving us immediately, we had quite a long tete-a-tete, and I was not only pleased but really instructed. I never heard a more fluent talker, or a man of greater general information. With becoming modesty, he forbore, nevertheless, to touch upon the theme I had just then most at heart. I mean the mysterious circumstances attending the Bugaboo War, and on my own part, what I conceived to be a proper sense of delicacy, forbade me to broach the subject, although in truth I was exceedingly tempted to do so. I perceived, too, that the gallant soldier preferred topics of philosophical interest, and that he delighted especially in commenting upon the rapid march of mechanical invention. Indeed, lead him where I would, this was a point to which he invariably came back. "There is nothing at all like it," he would say. "We are a wonderful people, and live in a wonderful age. Parachutes and railroads, man-traps and spring guns. Our steamboats are upon every sea, and the Nassau balloon packet is about to run regular trips, fare either way only £20 sterling, between London and Timbuktu. And who shall calculate the immense influence upon social life, upon arts, upon commerce, upon literature, which will be the immediate result of the great principles of electromagnetics? Nor is this all, let me assure you. There is really no end to the march of invention. The most wonderful, the most ingenious, and let me add, Mr. Thompson, I believe is your name. Let me add, I may say, the most useful, the most truly useful mechanical contrivances are daily springing up like mushrooms, if I may so express myself, or, more figuratively, like grasshoppers, Mr. Thompson, about us and around us. Thompson, to be sure, is not my name, but it is needless to say that I left General Smith with a heightened interest in the man, with an exalted opinion of his conversational powers, and a deep sense of the valuable privileges we enjoy in living in this age of mechanical invention. My curiosity, however, had not been altogether satisfied, and I resolved to prosecute immediate inquiry among my acquaintances touching the brevet brigadier general himself, and particularly respecting the tremendous events quorum pars magna fuit during the Bugaboo and Kickapoo campaign. The first opportunity which presented itself, and which, horresco referens, I did not in the least scruple to seize, occurred at the church of the Reverend Dr. Drumamup, where I found myself established one Sunday just at sermon time, not only in the pew, but by the side of that worthy and communicative little friend of mine, Miss Tabitha T. Thus seated, I congratulated myself, and with much reason, upon the very flattering state of affairs. If any person knew anything about Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith, that person, it was clear to me, was Miss Tabitha T. We telegraphed a few signals, and then commenced sotto voce a brisk tete-a-tete. "Smith," said she, in reply to my very earnest inquiry. "Smith! Why not General A.B.C.? Bless me, I thought you knew all about him. This is a wonderfully inventive age. Horrid affair, that. A bloody set of wretches, those Kickapoos. Fought like a hero, prodigies of valour, immortal renown. Smith, Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Why, you know he's the man." "Man!" here broke in Dr. Drumamup at the top of his voice, and with a thump that came near knocking the pulpit about our ears. "Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live. He cometh up and is cut down like a flower." I started to the extremity of the pew, and perceived by the animated looks of the divine that the wrath which had nearly proved fatal to the pulpit had been excited by the whispers of the lady and myself. There was no help for it, so I submitted with a good grace and listened, in all the martyrdom of dignified silence, to the balance of that very capital discourse. Next evening found me a somewhat late visitor at the Rantipole Theatre, where I felt sure of satisfying my curiosity at once, by merely stepping into the box of those exquisite specimens of affability and omniscience, the Mrs. Arabella and Miranda Cognoscenti. That fine tragedian Climax was doing Iago to a very crowded house, and I experienced some little difficulty in making my wishes understood, especially as our box was next the slips and completely overlooked the stage. "Smith," said Miss Arabella, as she at length comprehended the purport of my query. "Smith? Why, not General John A.B.C.?" "Smith?" inquired Miranda musingly. "God bless me, did you ever behold a finer figure?" "Never, madam, but do tell me." "Or so inimitable grace?" "Never, upon my word, but pray inform me." "Or so just an appreciation of stage effect?" "Madam." "Or a more delicate sense of the true beauties of Shakespeare? Be so good as to look at that leg." "The devil!" And I turned again to her sister. "Smith," said she, "why not General John A.B.C.? Horrid affair, that, wasn't it? Great wretches, those bugaboos, savage and so on. But we live in a wonderfully inventive age. Smith, oh yes, great man, perfect desperado, immortal renown, prodigies of valour, never heard." This was given in a scream. "Bless my soul! Why, he's the man." "Mandragora! Nor all the drowsy syrups of the world shall ever medicine thee to that sweet sleep which thou owedst yesterday." Here roared out Climax just in my ear, and shaking his fist in my face all the time, in a way that I couldn't understand. I wouldn't. I left the Mrs. Cognoscenti immediately, went behind the scenes forthwith, and gave the beggarly scoundrel such a thrashing as I trust he will remember till the day of his death. At the soirée of the lovely widow Miss Kathleen O'Trump, I was confident that I should meet with no similar disappointment. Accordingly, I was no sooner seated at the card-table with my pretty hostess for a vis-à-vis than I propounded those questions, the solution of which had become a matter so essential to my peace. "Smith," said my partner, "why not General John A.B.C.? Horrid affair that, wasn't it? Diamonds, did you say? Terrible wretches, those Kickapoos. We are playing whist, if you please, Mr. Tattle. However, this is the age of invention, most certainly, the age, one may say, the age par excellence. Speak French? Oh, quite a hero, perfect desperado. No hearts, Mr. Tattle? I don't believe it. Immortal renown and all that. Prodigies of valour, never heard. Why, bless me, he's the man." "Man! Captain Man!" here screamed some little feminine interloper from the farthest corner of the room. "Are you talking about Captain Man and the duel? Oh, I must hear. Do tell. Go on, Mrs. O'Trump. Now do go on." And go on Mrs. O'Trump did. All about a certain Captain Man, who was either shot or hung, or should have been both shot and hung. Yes, Mrs. O'Trump, she went on, and I went off. There was no chance of hearing anything further that evening in regard to Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. Still, I consoled myself with the reflection that the tide of ill luck would not run against me forever, and so determined to make a bold push for information at the rout of that bewitching little angel, the graceful Mrs. Pirouette. "Smith," said Mrs. P., as we twirled about together in a pas de zephyr. "Smith, why not General John A.B.C.? Dreadful business that of the bugaboos, wasn't it? Dreadful creatures, those Indians. Do turn out your toes. I really am ashamed of you. Great man of courage, poor fellow. But this is a wonderful age for invention. Oh, dear me, I'm out of breath. Quite a desperado. Prodigies of valor. Never heard. Can't believe it. I shall have to sit down and enlighten you. Smith, why, he's the man. Manfred, I tell you. Here bawled out Miss Barbeleux as I led Mrs. Pirouette to a seat. Did ever anybody hear the like? It's Manfred, I say, and not at all by any means Man Friday. Here Miss Barbeleux beckoned to me in a very peremptory manner, and I was obliged, will-I-nil-I, to leave Mrs. P. for the purpose of deciding a dispute touching the title of a certain poetic drama of Lord Byron's. Although I pronounced with great promptness that the true title was Man Friday, and not by any means Manfred, yet when I returned to seek Mrs. Pirouette, she was not to be discovered, and I made my retreat from the house in a very bitter spirit of animosity against the whole race of the Barbeleuxs. Matters had now assumed a really serious aspect, and I resolved to call at once upon my particular friend, Mr. Theodore Sinovate, for I knew that here at least I should get something like definite information. "Smith," said he, in his well-known peculiar way of drawling out his syllables. "Smith, why not General John A.B.C.? Savage affair, that with the Kickapoos, wasn't it? Say, don't you think so? Perfect desperado. Great pity. 'Pon my honour. Wonderfully inventive age. Prodigies of valour. By the by, did you ever hear about Captain Man?" "Captain Man be damned," said I. "Please to go on with your story."
Oh, well, quite la même chose, as we say in France. Smith, Brigadier General John A.B.C.
I say. Here Mr. S. thought proper to put his finger to the side of his nose.
I say, you don't mean to insinuate now, really and truly and conscientiously, that you don't know all about that affair of Smith's as well as I do, eh? Smith? John A.B.C.? Why, bless me, he's the man."
"Mr. Sinovate," said I imploringly, "is he the man in the mask?"
"No," said he, looking wise, "nor the man in the moon."
This reply I considered a pointed and positive insult, and so left the house at once in high dudgeon with a firm resolve to call my friend Mr. Sinovate to a speedy account for his ungentlemanly conduct and ill-breeding. In the meantime, however, I had no notion of being thwarted touching the information I desired. There was one resource left me yet. I would go to the fountain-head. I would call forthwith upon the General himself, and demand in explicit terms a solution of this abominable piece of mystery. Here at least there should be no chance for equivocation. I would be plain, positive, peremptory, as short as pie crust, as concise as Tacitus or Montesquieu. It was early when I called, and the General was dressing, but I pleaded urgent business, and was shown at once into his bedroom by an old negro valet, who remained in attendance during my visit. As I entered the chamber, I looked about, of course, for the occupant, but did not immediately perceive him. There was a large and exceedingly odd-looking bundle of something, which lay close by my feet on the floor, and, as I was not in the best humour in the world, I gave it a kick out of the way.
"Ahem, ahem! Rather civil, that, I should say,"
said the bundle, in one of the smallest and altogether the funniest little voices, between a squeak and a whistle, that I ever heard in all the days of my existence.
"Ahem! Rather civil, that, I should observe."
I fairly shouted with terror, and made off at a tangent into the farthest extremity of the room.
"God bless me, my dear fellow!"
Here again whistled the bundle.
What? Why, what is the matter? I really believe you don't know me at all."
What could I say to all this? What could I? I staggered into an armchair, and with staring eyes and open mouth awaited the solution of the wonder.
"Strange you shouldn't know me, though, isn't it?"
presently re-squeaked the nondescript, which I now perceived was performing upon the floor some inexplicable evolution very analogous to the drawing on of a stocking. There was only a single leg, however, apparent.
"Strange you shouldn't know me, though, isn't it? Pompey, bring me that leg."
Here Pompey handled the bundle a very capital cork leg, already dressed, which it screwed on in a trice, and then it stood up before my eyes.
"And a bloody action it was,"
continued the thing, as if in a soliloquy.
"But then one mustn't fight with the bugaboos and kickapoos and think of coming off with a mere scratch. Pompey, I'll thank you now for that arm. Thomas,"
turning to me,
"is decidedly the best hand at a cork leg. But if you should ever want an arm, my dear fellow, you must really let me recommend you to Bishop."
Here Pompey screwed on an arm.
"We had rather hard work of it, that you may say. Now, you dog, slip on my shoulders and bosom. Pettit makes the best shoulders, but for a bosom you will have to go to Ducrot."
"Bosom?" said I.
"Pompey, will you never be ready with that wig? Scalping is a rough process after all, but then you can procure such a capital scratch at Delorme's."
"Scratch!"
"Now, my teeth! For a good set of these you had better go to Parmley's at once. High prices, but excellent work. I swallowed some very capital articles, though, when the big bugaboo rammed me down with the butt end of his rifle."
"Butt end rammed down? My eye!"
"Oh, yes, by the by, my eye. Here, Pompey, you scamp, screw it in. Those kickapoos are not so very slow at a gouge, but he's a belied man, that Dr. Williams, after all. You can't imagine how well I see with the eyes of his make."
I now began very clearly to perceive that the object before me was nothing more nor less than my new acquaintance, Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith. The manipulations of Pompey had made, I must confess, a very striking difference in the personal appearance of the man. The voice, however, still puzzled me no little. but even this apparent mystery was speedily cleared up.
"Pompey, you black rascal!" squeaked the general. "I really do believe you would let me go out without my pallet."
Hereupon the negro, grumbling out an apology, went up to his master, opened his mouth with the knowing air of a horse-jockey, and adjusted therein a somewhat singular-looking machine in a very dexterous manner that I could not altogether comprehend. The alteration, however, in the entire expression of the general's countenance was instantaneous and surprising. When he spoke again, his voice had resumed all that rich melody and strength which I had noticed upon our original introduction.
"Damn the vagabonds!"
said he in so clear a tone that I positively started at the change.
"Damn the vagabonds! They not only knocked in the roof of my mouth, but took the trouble to cut off at least 7/8 of my tongue. There isn't Bonfanti's equal, however, in America for really good articles of this description. I can recommend you to him with confidence."
Here the general bowed.
"And I assure you that I have the greatest pleasure in so doing."
I acknowledged his kindness in my best manner, and took leave of him at once with a perfect understanding of the true state of affairs, with a full comprehension of the mystery which had troubled me so long. It was evident. It was a clear case.
Brevet Brigadier General John A.B.C. Smith was the man that was used up.
The Sphinx. During the dread reign of the cholera in New York, I had accepted the invitation of a relative to spend a fortnight with him in the retirement of his cottage ornée on the banks of the Hudson. We had here around us all the ordinary means of summer amusement, and what with rambling in the woods, sketching, boating, fishing, bathing, music, and books, we should have passed the time pleasantly enough, but for the fearful intelligence which reached us every morning from the populous city. Not a day elapsed which did not bring us news of the decease of some acquaintance. Then, as the fatality increased, we learned to expect daily the loss of some friend. At length we trembled at the approach of every messenger. The very air from the south seemed to us redolent with death. That palsying thought, indeed, took entire possession of my soul. I could neither speak, think, nor dream of anything else. My host was of a less excitable temperament, and although greatly depressed in spirits, exerted himself to sustain my own. His richly philosophical intellect was not at any time affected by unrealities. To the substances of terror he was sufficiently alive, but of its shadows he had no apprehension. His endeavors to arouse me from the condition of abnormal gloom into which I had fallen were frustrated in great measure by certain volumes which I had found in his library. These were of a character to force into germination whatever seeds of hereditary superstition lay latent in my bosom. I had been reading these books without his knowledge, and thus he was often at a loss to account for the forcible impressions which had been made upon my fancy. A favorite topic with me was the popular belief in omens, a belief which, at this one epoch of my life, I was almost seriously disposed to defend. On this subject we had long and animated discussions, he maintaining the utter groundlessness of faith in such matters, I contending that a popular sentiment, arising with absolute spontaneity, that is to say, without apparent traces of suggestion, had in itself the unmistakable elements of truth, and was entitled to as much respect as that intuition which is the idiosyncrasy of the individual man of genius. Fact is that soon after my arrival at the cottage, there had occurred to myself an incident so entirely inexplicable, and which had in it so much of the portentous character, that I might well have been excused for regarding it as an omen. It appalled, and at the same time so confounded and bewildered me, that many days elapsed before I could make up my mind to communicate the circumstances to my friend. Near the close of an exceedingly warm day, I was sitting, book in hand, at an open window, commanding, through a long vista of the river banks, a view of a distant hill, the face of which, nearest my position, had been denuded, by what is termed a landslide, of the principal portion of its trees. My thoughts had been long wandering from the volume before me to the gloom and desolation of the neighboring city. Uplifting my eyes from the page, they fell upon the naked face of the hill, and upon an object, upon some living monster of hideous conformation which very rapidly made its way from the summit to the bottom, disappearing finally in the dense forest below. As this creature first came in sight, I doubted my own sanity, or at least the evidence of my own eyes, and many minutes passed before I succeeded in convincing myself that I was neither mad nor in a dream. Yet when I described the monster, which I distinctly saw and calmly surveyed through the whole period of its progress, my readers, I fear, will feel more difficulty in being convinced of these points than even I did myself. Estimating the size of the creature by comparison with the diameter of the large trees near which it passed, the few giants of the forest which had escaped the fury of the landslide, I concluded it to be far larger than any ship of the line in existence. I say ship of the line because the shape of the monster suggested the idea. The hull of one of our 74 might convey a very tolerable conception of the general outline. The mouth of the animal was situated at the extremity of a proboscis, some 60 or 70 feet in length, and about as thick as the body of an ordinary elephant. Near the root of this trunk was an immense quantity of black shaggy hair, more than could have been supplied by the coats of a score of buffaloes, and projecting from this hair downwardly and laterally sprang two gleaming tusks, not unlike those of the wild boar, but of infinitely greater dimensions. Extending forward, parallel with the proboscis, and on each side of it, was a gigantic staff, 30 or 40 feet in length, formed seemingly of pure crystal, and in shape a perfect prism. It reflected in the most gorgeous manner the rays of the declining sun. The trunk was fashioned like a wedge, with the apex to the earth. From it there were outspread 2 pairs of wings, each wing nearly 100 yards in length, one pair being placed above the other, and all thickly covered with metal scales, each scale apparently some 10 or 12 feet in diameter. I observed that the upper and lower tiers of wings were connected by a strong chain. But the chief peculiarity of this horrible thing was the representation of a death's head, which covered nearly the whole surface of its breast, and which was as accurately traced in glaring white upon the dark ground of the body as if it had been there carefully designed by an artist. While I regarded the terrific animal, and more especially the appearance on its breast, with a feeling of horror and awe, with a sentiment of forthcoming evil which I found it impossible to quell by any effort of the reason, I perceived the huge jaws of the extremity of the proboscis suddenly expand themselves, and from them there proceeded a sound so loud and so expressive of woe that it struck upon my nerves like a knell, and as the monster disappeared at the foot of the hill, I fell at once fainting to the floor. Upon recovering, my first impulse, of course, was to inform my friend of what I had seen and heard, and I can scarcely explain what feeling of repugnance it was which in the end operated to prevent me. At length, one evening, some 3 or 4 days after the occurrence, we were sitting together in the room in which I had seen the apparition, I occupying the same seat at the same window, and he lounging on a sofa near at hand. The association of the place and time impelled me to give him an account of the phenomenon. He heard me to the end, at first laughed heartily, and then lapsed into an excessively grave demeanour, as if my insanity was a thing beyond suspicion. At this instant I again had a distinct view of the monster, to which with a shout of absolute terror I now directed his attention. He looked eagerly, but maintained that he saw nothing, although I designated minutely the course of the creature as it made its way down the naked face of the hill. I was now immeasurably alarmed, for I considered the vision either as an omen of my death, or, worse, as the forerunner of an attack of mania. I threw myself passionately back in my chair, and for some moments buried my face in my hands. When I uncovered my eyes, the apparition was no longer apparent. My host, however, had in some degree resumed the calmness of his demeanour, and questioned me very rigorously in respect to the conformation of the visionary creature. When I had fully satisfied him on this head, he sighed deeply, as if relieved of some intolerable burden, and went on to talk, with what I thought a cruel calmness, of various points of speculative philosophy, which had heretofore formed subject of discussion between us. I remember his insisting very especially, among other things, upon the idea that the principal source of error in all human investigations lay in the liability of the understanding to underrate or overvalue the importance of an object, through mere misadmeasurement of its propinquity. To estimate properly, for example, he said, the influence to be exercised on mankind at large by the thorough diffusion of democracy, the distance of the epoch at which such diffusion may possibly be accomplished, should not fail to form an item in the estimate. Yet can you tell me one writer on the subject of government who has ever thought this particular branch of the subject worthy of discussion at all? Here he paused for a moment, stepped to a bookcase, and brought forth one of the ordinary synopses of natural history. Requesting me then to exchange seats with him, that he might the better distinguish the fine print of the volume, he took my armchair at the window, and, opening the book, resumed his discourse very much in the same tone as before. "But for your exceeding minuteness," he said, "in describing the monster, I might never have had it in my power to demonstrate to you what it was. In the first place, let me read to you a schoolboy account of the genus Sphinx, of the family Crepuscularia, of the order Lepidoptera, of the class of Insecta, or insects. The account runs thus. 4 membranous wings, covered with little coloured scales of metallic appearance.
mouth forming a roll proboscis produced by an elongation of the jaws, upon the sides of which are found the rudiments of mandibles and downy palpi, the inferior wings retained to the superior by a stiff hair. Antennae in the form of an elongated club, prismatic, abdomen pointed. The death's head Sphinx has occasioned much terror among the vulgar, at times by the melancholy kind of cry which it utters, and the insignia of death which it wears upon its corselet. Here he closed the book and leaned forward in the chair, placing himself accurately in the position which I had occupied at the moment of beholding the monster. "Ah, here it is," he presently exclaimed. "It is reascending the face of the hill, and a very remarkable-looking creature I admit it to be. Still, it is by no means so large or so distant as you imagined it. For the fact is, as it wriggles its way up this thread which some spider has wrought along the window sash, I find it to be about the 16th of an inch in its extreme length, and also about the 16th of an inch distant from the pupil of my eye."
The Angel of the Odd, 1844, Edgar Allan Poe. From the Columbian Magazine, October, 1844. It was a chilly November afternoon. I had just consummated an unusually hearty dinner, of which the dyspeptic truffa formed not the least important item, and was sitting alone in the dining-room with my feet upon the fender, and at my elbow a small table, which I had rolled up to the fire, and upon which were some apologies for dessert, with some miscellaneous bottles of wine, spirit, and liqueur. In the morning I had been reading Glover's Leonidas, Wilkie's Epigoniad, Lamartine's Pilgrimage, Barlow's Columbiad, Tuckerman's Sicily, and Griswold's Curiosities. I am willing to confess, therefore, that I now felt a little stupid. I made efforts to arouse myself by frequent aid of Lafitte, and all failing, I betook myself to a stray newspaper in despair. Having carefully perused the column of Houses to Let, and the column of Dogs Lost, and then the columns of Wives and Apprentices Runaway, I attacked with great resolution the editorial matter, and reading it from beginning to end, without understanding a syllable, conceived the possibility of its being Chinese, and so reread it from the end to the beginning, but with no more satisfactory result. I was about throwing away in disgust this folio of 4 pages, happy work which not even critics criticize, when I felt my attention somewhat aroused by the paragraph which follows. The avenues to death are numerous and strange. A London paper mentions the decease of a person from a singular cause. He was playing at Puff the Dart, which is played with a long needle inserted in some worsted and blown at a target through a tin tube. He placed the needle at the wrong end of the tube, and, drawing his breath strongly to puff the dart forward with force, drew the needle into his throat. It entered the lungs, and in a few days killed him. Upon seeing this, I fell into a great rage, without exactly knowing why. "This thing," I exclaimed, "is a contemptible falsehood, a poor hoax, the lees of the invention of some pitiable penny a liner, of some wretched concocter of accidents in cocaine. These fellows, knowing the extravagant gullibility of the age, set their wits to work in the imagination of improbable possibilities, of odd accidents, as they term them, but to a reflecting intellect, like mine," I added in parentheses, putting my forefinger unconsciously to the side of my nose, to a contemplative understanding, such as I myself possess, it seems evident at once that the marvellous increase of late in these odd accidents is by far the oddest accident of all. For my own part, I intend to believe nothing henceforward that has anything of the singular about it. "Mein Gott, den what a vool you been for dat!" replied one of the most remarkable voices I ever heard. At first I took it for a rumbling in my ears, such as a man sometimes experiences when getting very drunk, but upon second thought I considered the sound as more nearly resembling that which proceeds from an empty barrel beaten with a big stick. And in fact this I should have concluded it to be, but for the articulation of the syllables and words. I am by no means naturally nervous, and the very few glasses of Lafitte which I had sipped served to embolden me a little, so that I felt nothing of trepidation, but merely uplifted my eyes with a leisurely movement and looked carefully around the room for the intruder. I could not, however, perceive any one at all. "Hm!" resumed the voice, as I continued my survey. "You must pe so drunk as de pig-pen for not see me as I zit here at your zide." Hereupon I bethought me of looking immediately before my nose, and there, sure enough, confronting me at the table, sat a personage nondescript, although not altogether indescribable. His body was a wine pipe, or a rum puncheon, or something of that character, and had a truly Falstaffian air. In its nether extremity were inserted two kegs, which seemed to answer all the purposes of legs. For arms there dangled from the upper portion of the carcass two tolerably long bottles with the necks outward for hands. All the head that I saw the monster possessed of was one of those Hessian canteens, which resemble a large snuff box with a hole in the middle of the lid. This canteen, with a funnel on its top like a cavalier cap slouched over the eyes, was set on edge upon the puncheon, with the hole toward myself, and through this hole, which seemed puckered up like the mouth of a very precise old maid, the creature was emitting certain rumbling and grumbling noises which he evidently intended for intelligible talk. "I zay," said he, "you must pe drunk as de pig, vor zit there and not zee me zit here, and I zay, do you most pe pigger fool as de goose for to disbelief vat is print in de print. 'Tis de truth, dat it is, every vord ob it." "Who are you, pray?" said I, with much dignity, although somewhat puzzled. "How did you get here, and what is it you are talking about?" "As for how I come here," replied the figure, "dat is none of your pizness. And as for vat I be talking about, I be talk about vat I tink proper. And as for who I be, vy dat is de very ting I come here for to let you zee for yourself." "You are a drunken vagabond," said I, "and I shall ring the bell and order my footman to kick you into the street." "He, he, he!" said the fellow. "Ho, ho, ho, ho! Dot you can't do." "Can't do!" said I. "What do you mean? I can't do what?" "Ring de pell," he replied, attempting a grin with his little villainous mouth. Upon this I made an effort to get up in order to put my threat into execution, but the ruffian just reached across the table very deliberately, and, hitting me a tap on the forehead with the neck of one of the long bottles, knocked me back into the arm-chair from which I had half arisen. I was utterly astounded, and for a moment was quite at a loss what to do. In the meantime he continued his talk. "You see," said he, "it is te best for zit still. And now you shall know who I pe. Look at me. See, I am te angel of de odd." And odd enough, too, I ventured to reply, but I was always under the impression an angel had wings. "De wing!" he cried, highly incensed. "What I do mit de wing? Mein Gott, do you take me for a chicken?" "No, oh, no," I replied, much alarmed. "You are no chicken, certainly not." "Well, den, zit still and behave yourself, or I'll rap you again mit me visit. It is de chicken op de wing, and de owl op de wing, and de imp op de wing, and de head teufel op de wing, de angel op not de wing, and I am de angel op de odd." "And your business with me at present is—" "My business!" ejaculated the thing. "Vy, what a low-bred puppy you must pe for to ask a gentleman and an angel apout his business." This language was rather more than I could bear, even from an angel, so plucking up courage I seized a salt cellar which lay within reach and hurled it at the head of the intruder. Either he dodged, however, or my aim was inaccurate, for all I accomplished was the demolition of the crystal which protected the dial of the clock upon the mantelpiece. As for the angel, he evinced his sense of my assault by giving me 2 or 3 hard, consecutive raps upon the forehead as before. These reduced me at once to submission, and I am almost ashamed to confess that, either through pain or vexation, there came a few tears into my eyes. "Mein Gott!" said the angel of the odd, apparently much softened at my distress. "Mein Gott! De man is either very drunk or very sorry. You must not drink it so strong. You must put de water in de wine. Here, drink dis, like a good veller, and don't cry now, don't." Hereupon the angel of the odd replenished my goblet, which was about 1/3 full of port, with a colorless fluid that he poured from one of his hand bottles. I observed that these bottles had labels about their necks, and that these labels were inscribed Kirchenwasser. The considerate kindness of the angel mollified me in no small measure, and, aided by the water with which he diluted my port more than once, I at length regained sufficient temper to listen to his very extraordinary discourse. I cannot pretend to recount all that he told me, but I gleaned from what he said that he was a genius who presided over the contretemps of mankind, and whose business it was to bring about the odd accidents which are continually astonishing the skeptic. Once or twice, upon my venturing to express my total incredulity in respect to his pretensions, he grew very angry indeed, so that at length I considered it the wiser policy to say nothing at all, and let him have his own way. He talked on, therefore, at great length, while I merely leaned back in my chair with my eyes shut, and amused myself with munching raisins and filliping the stems about the room. But by and by the angel suddenly construed this behavior of mine into contempt. He arose in a terrible passion, slouched his funnel down over his eyes, swore a vast oath, uttered a threat of some character which I did not precisely comprehend, and finally made me a low bow and departed, wishing me, in the language of the Archbishop in Gil Bias, beaucoup de bonheur et un peu plus de bon sens. His departure afforded me relief. The very few glasses of Lafitte that I had sipped had the effect of rendering me drowsy, and I felt inclined to take a nap of some 15 or 20 minutes, as is my custom after dinner. At 6 I had an appointment of consequence, which it was quite indispensable that I should keep. The policy of insurance for my dwelling house had expired the day before, and some dispute having arisen, it was agreed that, at 6, I should meet the board of directors of the company and settle the terms of a renewal. Glancing upward at the clock on the mantelpiece, for I felt too drowsy to take out my watch, I had the pleasure to find that I had still 25 minutes to spare. It was 5:30. I could easily walk to the insurance office in 5 minutes, and my usual siestas had never been known to exceed 25. I felt sufficiently safe, therefore, and composed myself to my slumbers forthwith. Having completed them to my satisfaction, I again looked toward the timepiece, and was half inclined to believe in the possibility of odd accidents, when I found that, instead of my ordinary 15 or 20 minutes, I had been dozing only 3, for it still wanted 7:20 of the appointed hour. I betook myself again to my nap, and at length a second time awoke, when, to my utter amazement, it still wanted 27 minutes of 6. I jumped up to examine the clock, and found that it had ceased running. My watch informed me that it was 7:30, and, of course, having slept 2 hours, I was too late for my appointment. "It will make no difference," I said. "I can call at the office in the morning and apologize. In the meantime, what can be the matter with the clock?" Upon examining it, I discovered that one of the raisin stems which I had been filliping about the room during the discourse of the Angel of the Odd had flown through the fractured crystal, and lodging, singularly enough, in the keyhole, with an end projecting outward, had thus arrested the revolution of the minute hand. "Ah," said I see how it is. This thing speaks for itself, a natural accident, such as will happen now and then." I gave the matter no further consideration, and at my usual hour retired to bed. Here, having placed a candle upon a reading stand at the bed head, and having made an attempt to peruse some pages of the Omnipresence of the Deity, I unfortunately fell asleep in less than 20 seconds, leaving the light burning as it was. My dreams were terrifically disturbed by visions of the Angel of the Odd. Methought he stood at the foot of the couch, drew aside the curtains, and in the hollow, detestable tones of a rum puncheon menaced me with the bitterest vengeance for the contempt with which I had treated him. He concluded a long harangue by taking off his funnel cap, inserting the tube into my gullet, and thus deluging me with an ocean of Kirschenwasser, which he poured in a continuous flood from one of the long-necked bottles that stood him instead of an arm. My agony was at length insufferable, and I awoke just in time to perceive that a rat had run off with the lighted candle from the stand, but not in season to prevent his making his escape with it through the hole. Very soon a strong, suffocating odor assailed my nostrils. The house, I clearly perceived, was on fire. In a few minutes the blaze broke forth with violence, and in an incredibly brief period the entire building was wrapped in flames. All egress from my chamber, except through a window, was cut off. The crowd, however, quickly procured and raised a long ladder. By means of this I was descending rapidly, and in apparent safety, when a huge hog, about whose rotund stomach, and indeed about whose whole air and physiognomy, there was something which reminded me of the Angel of the Odd, when this hog, I say, which hitherto had been quietly slumbering in the mud, took it suddenly into his head that his left shoulder needed scratching, and could find no more convenient rubbing post than that afforded by the foot of the ladder. In an instant I was precipitated, and had the misfortune to fracture my arm. This accident, with the loss of my insurance, and with the more serious loss of my hair, the whole of which had been singed off by the fire, predisposed me to serious impressions, so that finally I made up my mind to take a wife. There was a rich widow, disconsolate for the loss of her 7th husband, and to her wounded spirit I offered the balm of my vows. She yielded a reluctant consent to my prayers. I knelt at her feet in gratitude and adoration. she blushed and bowed her luxuriant tresses into close contact with those supplied me temporarily by Grandjean. I know not how the entanglement took place, but so it was. I arose with a shining pate, wigless; she in disdain and wrath, half buried in alien hair. Thus ended my hopes of the widow by an accident which could not have been anticipated, to be sure, but which the natural sequence of events had brought about. Without despairing, however, I undertook the siege of a less implacable heart. The fates were again propitious for a brief period, but again a trivial incident interfered. Meeting my betrothed in an avenue thronged with the elite of the city, I was hastening to greet her with one of my best considered bows, when a small particle of some foreign matter, lodging in the corner of my eye, rendered me for the moment completely blind. Before I could recover my sight, the lady of my love had disappeared, irreparably affronted at what she chose to consider my premeditated rudeness in passing her by ungreeted. While I stood bewildered at the suddenness of this accident, which might have happened, nevertheless, to any one under the sun, and while I still continued incapable of sight, I was accosted by the Angel of the Odd, who proffered me his aid with a civility which I had no reason to expect. He examined my disordered eye with much gentleness and skill, informed me that I had a drop in it, and whatever a drop was, took it out, and afforded me relief. I now considered it high time to die, since fortune had so determined to persecute me, and accordingly made my way to the nearest river. Here, divesting myself of my clothes, for there is no reason why we cannot die as we were born, I threw myself headlong into the current, the sole witness of my fate being a solitary crow that had been seduced into the eating of brandy saturated corn, and so had staggered away from his fellows. No sooner had I entered the water than this bird took it into his head to fly away with the most indispensable portion of my apparel. Postponing, therefore, for the present my suicidal design, I just slipped my nether extremities into the sleeves of my coat, and betook myself to a pursuit of the felon with all the nimbleness which the case required, and its circumstances would admit. But my evil destiny attended me still. As I ran at full speed, with my nose up in the atmosphere, and intent only upon the purloiner of my property, I suddenly perceived that my feet rested no longer upon terra firma. The fact is, I had thrown myself over a precipice, and should inevitably have been dashed to pieces, but for my good fortune in grasping the end of a long guide rope, which depended from a passing balloon. As soon as I sufficiently recovered my senses to comprehend the terrific predicament in which I stood, or rather hung, I exerted all the power of my lungs to make that predicament known to the aeronaut overhead, but for a long time I exerted myself in vain. Either the fool could not, or the villain would not, perceive me. Meanwhile the machine rapidly soared, while my strength even more rapidly failed. I was soon upon the point of resigning myself to my fate, and dropping quietly into the sea, when my spirits were suddenly revived by hearing a hollow voice from above, which seemed to be lazily humming an opera air. Looking up, I perceived the Angel of the Odd. He was leaning, with his arms folded, over the rim of the car, and with a pipe in his mouth, at which he puffed leisurely, seeming to be upon excellent terms with himself and the universe. I was too much exhausted to speak, so I merely regarded him with an imploring air. For several minutes, although he looked me full in the face, he said nothing. At length Removing carefully his meerschaum from the right to the left corner of his mouth, he condescended to speak. "Who pe you?" he asked, "and what der Teufel you pe do dare?" To this piece of impudence, cruelty, and affectation I could reply only by ejaculating the monosyllable "Help!" "Help!" echoed the ruffian. "Not I. Der is de pottle. Help yourself, und be damned!" With these words he let fall a heavy bottle of Kirschenwasser, which, dropping precisely upon the crown of my head, caused me to imagine that my brains were entirely knocked out. Impressed with this idea, I was about to relinquish my hold, and give up the ghost with a good grace, when I was arrested by the cry of the angel, who bade me hold on. "Hold on!" he said. "Don't be in de hurry. Don't. Will you pe take de oder bottle, und have you pe got sober yet, and come to your senses?" I made haste hereupon to nod my head twice, once in the negative, meaning thereby that I would prefer not taking the other bottle at present, and once in the affirmative, intending thus to imply that I was sober and had positively come to my senses. By these means I somewhat softened the angel. "Und you pelief ten," he inquired, "in te last? You pelief ten in te possibility of te odd?" I again nodded my head in assent. "Und you have pelief in me, te angel of te odd?" I nodded again. "Und you acknowledge dat you pe te blind drunk und te fool?" I nodded once more. "Put your right hand into your left breeches pocket, ten, in token of your full submission unto te angel of te odd." This thing, for very obvious reasons, I found it quite impossible to do. In the first place, my left arm had been broken in my fall from the ladder, and therefore had I let go my hold with the right hand, I must have let go altogether. In the second place, I could have no breeches until I came across the crow. I was therefore obliged, much to my regret, to shake my head in the negative, intending thus to give the angel to understand that I found it inconvenient, just at that moment, to comply with his very reasonable demand. No sooner, however, had I ceased shaking my head than "Go to der Teufel, den!" roared the angel of the odd. In pronouncing these words, he drew a sharp knife across the guide rope by which I was suspended, and as we then happened to be precisely over my own house, which during my peregrinations had been handsomely rebuilt, it so occurred that I tumbled headlong down the ample chimney and alit upon the dining-room hearth. Upon coming to my senses, for the fall had very thoroughly stunned me, I found it about 4 o'clock in the morning. I lay outstretched where I had fallen from the balloon, my head grovelled in the ashes of an extinguished fire, while my feet reposed upon the wreck of a small table, overthrown, and amid the fragments of a miscellaneous dessert, intermingled with a newspaper, some broken glasses and shattered bottles, and an empty jug of the Schiedam Kirschenwasser. Thus avenged himself the angel of the odd.